is a form of systemic oppression with a specific function, usually to deflect blame for hardships, to discredit leaders or institutions, or to create an imagined enemy from within, used to justify removing or damaging fundamental freedoms and democratic institutions like freedom of speech or the right to vote.
Thank you. Would anyone else be interested in reading the next 3 lines out? Thank you.
It is often a form of conspiracy theory used to generate fear and division. It is distinct but connected to other forms of identity-based oppression and present in all sectors of American society. It harms Jewish people and
system of oppression with a specific function is different than how a lot of people have heard of it before, right? And I want to remember a few things from this. The idea of specific function. What are the specific functions of anti-Semitism? The idea of creating an imagined enemy, and ultimately this idea of damaging fundamental freedoms. That's a really important part of when we think about anti-Semitism, the idea of a function. What is it being used for? So let's just hold that and we'll come back to it. Okay, one thing some people might have heard again is the idea that anti-Semitism is cyclical in nature. When we think of a lot of oppressions and the fights against or to dismantle oppression, we think like it goes in one direction, right? Oppression is bad and we can fight to make it better. Anti-Semitism, it's really helpful to think about it being cyclical. When anti-Jewish oppression isn't at its most brutal, it can be really hard to see. There's a cycle, it disappears from public view. Many times it has kept Jews in poverty or designated Jews as non-white. These have been optional features because the point of anti-Jewish oppression or anti-Semitism is to keep a Jewish face in front so that Jews, instead of the ruling classes, become targets for people's rage. It works even more smoothly when Jews are allowed some successes and can be perceived as the ones in charge by oppressed groups. So here we're getting into a little complicated thing, but this is the idea that for anti-Semitism to function, there has to be times when Jews succeed. It doesn't actually work if Jews are always poor, unable to access institutions, that kind of thing. It relies on Jews being able to succeed and then being used, right, as the face of the bad thing happening. Let's go to the next slide and then I'll do a little bit of example telling. Perfect. So when we think of the history of anti-Semitism, attacks come in waves, and each time things calm down and Jews are able to blend or succeed in society, it gives the appearance that anti-Semitism is over, right? That it doesn't exist anymore. But actually, this is an important part of the way anti-Semitism functions. It gives the appearance of not existing and then can flare up again. So some of the most famous examples of anti-Semitism throughout history is actually where Jews have been really successful, have blended into society, have been accepted, have been allowed access. Probably the most famous one is if you think about German Jews in the Weimar Republic in the lead up to the Second World War and the Holocaust, right? German Jews were really well integrated into society. They weren't treated like, for example, the Roma were treated or people of color were treated in Weimar Germany. They weren't treated in the same way. They were famous professors and business people. That is actually an important part of how anti-Semitism works. It relies on Jews being enabled to succeed and then blamed as the architect of whatever ills society is facing. So in pre-Nazi Germany, there were lots of Jewish scholars, particularly liberal Jewish scholars. There were lots of Jewish business people. So when the economy was bad, right, they could blame Jews and say, look at all these Jewish bankers and business people, they're the reason for our bad economy, therefore that's the problem. These weren't necessarily like working class Jews or people who were very poor or downtrodden. They'd gone to university, that kind of thing. So that's a really important part of this. It can often be hidden. Like, it often isn't so visible. Great. I want to get some thoughts from the crowd. Who can think of some examples throughout history or modern day where Jews have been targeted through anti-Semitism, either on a small or a large level? And is there a part of it that whether this idea of the cycle, where this idea of a conspiracy theory, and where the idea of Jews being used to achieve some other aim comes up? We'll take 2 or 3 examples.
Thank you. These are some new ideas, so thank you. I was reading about the Black Plague in the 1350s. Doesn't everybody? And what happened was the town started to round up the Jews, put them in their homes, and set fire. And they thought it would be a way to save the town from the plague. And I have to say, this is one of the few times a pope did something well. The Pope said they are not the cause of the plague. They're dying as much as we are, and they ignored them.
That's a great example. Thank you. Actually, an interesting fact about some of that during the Black Plague is, so in Jewish tradition, it is a ritual tradition that you wash your hands ritually before every single meal. It's been that way since, biblical times. It's part of what you have to do. And in Europe during the plague, actually Jews were not as impacted by the plague as other groups were, because they washed their hands ritually before doing both eating, also before medical treatment. You have to wash your hands. Before killing an animal, you had to wash your hands. So Jews were in fact not dying of the plague in the same numbers as non-Jews, which is one of the reasons why people thought that they were the cause of the plague. And then the awful things happened as a result. But that's a really good example, right? Yeah.
What do I do? Do I stand?
You feel free to stay seated and go for it.
Okay. Come in. Can you hear me?
Yes.
If I understand your question, and I'm having difficulty understanding you, I'm afraid, because I am old and you speak so fast, it's hard to keep up with you. But you're asking, can we think of an example of systemic anti-Semitism? And I can turn to today's front page and all the palaver about Charlie Kirk. And if you just YouTube him, his polemics against American Jews in particular, and then it slides to Israel, are bold-facedly, unabashedly anti-Semitic, but not in the way you are describing it. You're kind of doing a historical overlook, but to me, that is both real, it ain't going away, it's a big threat, and I hope somewhere in the, as we unspool this discussion, you might talk a little bit about that new threat that seems to be threatening all of us.
Thank you so much. With that, I can actually move us on to the next slide, which addresses all of this. Okay, so I've put up some examples that are very different, right? These are all from way, way back when to modern. And I'm going to talk through a couple and how this idea of anti-Semitism as a conspiracy that is being used, right? That thing, who is using this, where Jews are being used to achieve some sort of other aim, or there is a cycle happening. So one interesting example, Jewish tax collectors expelled from European countries. Who knows why many Jews became tax collectors? Or not tax collectors, sorry. Oh, wow, it's not tax collectors, it's moneylenders. Wow, I wrote the wrong thing in my slideshow. Who knows why Jews became moneylenders? Yeah, we'll go with the microphone is.
They weren't allowed to own land.
Yeah, great. There were two, exactly that one reason, and there's one other thing to add to it. We'll try one more.
Christians were not allowed to collect interest.
Exactly. So during really the medieval era, Christians were not allowed to collect interest, usury. I hate saying that word. And Jews were not allowed to own land and therefore couldn't own traditional businesses. And so as a kind of result of both oppression of the Jews and also a restriction of Christianity, Jews were pushed into this role of the moneylender which meant that they were looked down upon by a lot of society for doing something that was deemed bad for Christians, but also Christians needed them. And one of the things that happened is a lot of times wealthy landowners, Christians, even kings, and sometimes queens, would actually borrow money from the Jews. And when they got angry about having to pay that money back, or when they got indebted, they were many, many times throughout history where the Jews would then be expelled from that country, all their property would be seized, and all the debts would be cancelled, right? And they would often ground it, they wouldn't ground it in saying, I'm expelling the Jews because I want my debts to be cancelled. They'd say, I'm expelling the Jews because they are abusing our Christian children, or because they are Christ killers, or whatever it was. But the reason often was that they actually had put Jews in this situation financially and then used the Jews to solve their own problems. And so that's one example. I'll come back to some questions and hands up in a bit, so just hold thoughts, write them down. Another example of, again, this, how is anti-Semitism, how are Jews being used, right, throughout history? I'll give one more historic example, is with the Spanish Inquisition. Really famous example in the Iberian Peninsula, Spain, Portugal to a lesser extent, but also there was times of deep unpopularity of the crown there. Finances were bad. There had been plagues going around. Like, things were not good. And in response, the Spanish monarchy and church together were like, well, the Jews are the cause of all of this. We'll expel them. And if you think about how anti-immigration rhetoric works today, right, the idea of a distraction from the actual problems, people unfortunately lapped it all up, and the Jews were both expelled and forcibly converted in, obviously huge numbers, which in itself had a huge impact on Europe, because tons and tons of Jews went all across Europe after that. So those are two historic examples. I want to come to modern examples. You said yourself about Charlie Kirk and the alt-right and the rise of the rise of a new right-wing anti-Semitism. It's actually the same as the old one, but it's got new labels and new people on it. Who's heard of George Soros? Right. I actually think 10 years ago, almost no one in this room would have raised their hand, and I think that is very interesting. Have we heard of George Soros from the left, or have we heard him being talked about by the right? The right, yeah. George Soros is a Hungarian Jewish, he is either a Holocaust survivor or his parents were, but I think he was when he was very young, financier. I learned about him in Britain in economics class, about having crashed the British pound, which is, interesting. But he's a financial guy, and he made a lot of money on things that, as a left-wing person, I don't love. But he also has then used his money to fund something called the Open Society Foundation, which is a great foundation that funds a lot of really incredible pro-democracy, pro-environmental work, etc. And he is put up originally just in Hungary by the far right, and now all over the world, including in one of Trump's election ads, as the reason why we are in these crises. He is funding, I put Antifa there because that's the funniest one, but he is funding the pro-immigration movement. He's the reason migrants are at our borders. And in Hungary particularly, there were signs before the election of their president, Viktor Orban, who is a outright white nationalist, saying, pictures of George Soros, the liberal destroying our country. And then people would graffiti over it, the stinking Jew destroying our country. And if we think about this idea of conspiracy, of what are the Jews being used for, George Soros is a very successful man. He is not poor. He has not struggled with being excluded from things. To the average person, he looks successful and not oppressed, but he is being used to paint him as the bad guy for a lot of other people. And that's the important way this manifests. I'm going to do a last example. The really great tragedy in 2018 of the Tree of Life shooting in Pittsburgh. This I mean, it was an awful tragedy, but what's important about it is it wasn't random, right? It wasn't, you know, a lone gunman as people wanted it to be, unfortunately. The gunman had overtly referred to something called the Great Replacement Theory. Who's heard of Great Replacement Theory? And this is what the Charlie Kirks of this world push as an idea. Again, it's not a new idea. The name of it is new, but the idea is not new. And it's the idea that there is a shadowy, unnamed force explicitly pushing LGBTQ rights, racial equity, immigration, all in the name of, or all in the effort to, get rid of the majority of white people in any given country, to eliminate white people as the power people. And Great Replacement Theory is really popular with Trump, with his allies, with people on the right, because they really have bought into this, that it couldn't be random. It couldn't be because of, you know, post-colonial wars that people are trying to move here. It couldn't be because black people have done incredible organizing to fight for their own rights. It must be a shadowy cabal that has caused these changes, that is causing the rise of non-white people in our country. And it is a plan, and it is an attack on the white master race. And originally, it didn't necessarily mention Jews outright, but what we learn, and more recently we know, is that when people talk about the shadowy cabal trying to take over, they almost always mean Jews. And so while Great Replacement Theory isn't, it ties together anti-Semitism and racism and xenophobia. We're all targeted differently through it, but it is naming everyone as part of it. And the Tree of Life shooter heard that the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh was hosting a refugee Shabbat to support refugees, and in partnership with the organization called HIAS, that is a Jewish organization in support of refugees. And as part of that, the government thought this is the plan of the Jews being behind the waves of immigration we have going on. And that's why he went there and shot the Jews there. So there's a tie, right, between the same thing happening back in medieval Europe, back in the 1600s, the Holocaust today. It doesn't look the same, but underneath it, this story of the Jews as a shadowy influence is the same. Okay, I'm gonna pause for like 2 to 3 questions or resonances with what you've been learning.
Would you mind talking about the protocols of the Elders of Zion? Because
Yeah.
I've heard of them. I can't quite remember what it's all about.
The protocols of the Elders of Zion is, it's kind of almost like the most famous concrete example of the anti-Semitic conspiracy being like put down on paper, as it were. It was published in Russia in the 1800s. I'm not going to say more of a date than that because I'm going to get it wrong. And it was published not by Jews, in fact, despite the origin, and it was put out as though it was written by Jews, so it's pretend, and as though it is a plot of powerful Jews from around the world plotting to take over or having taken over the world, basically. And it started in Russia, was then translated. Most famously, Henry Ford brought it to the US, had it translated into English, and sent it out something like 80,000 copies. It might be more or less. I've not got the number right, but was a big distributor of it in the US. And it has maintained to this day. You can sometimes walk in extremely random places all over the world and see copies. And we know, it wasn't written by Jews. It is not true. But many, many, many people reading it back then and now believe that it is, in fact, written by Jews who are really bad plotting if they were writing their plan and publishing it, but that's beside the point, that they have plotted to take over the world. And that is, one of the most common myths you still hear today is about the idea of Jews, running the media, controlling the weather, having some shadowy cabal. Yeah. And one thing I'll connect this to, which is important and interesting, the conspiracy often doesn't make sense, right? And when you think about the protocols of the Elders of Zion and that era of the early 1900s, both you had the Jews as bankers, business people, the reason for your poverty, because they're taking all the money, they control the world. And at the same time, they're also the communists. And the threat of creeping communism and socialism is also the Jews. The conspiracy doesn't have to make sense. It just has to make you not want to be connected to the Jews and distrust the Jews. And that's what it has to achieve. It doesn't have to make sense. And that's a really important part of when we start to think about how we dismantle anti-Semitism is like, pause. What is actually being told here? What is the story being told? Who is it benefiting? How are Jews being used in it? And does it actually make sense based on the world that we know? I'm going to keep us moving. Let's go to the next slide, and I'll figure if we want to do a couple more questions or keep going. We will have time for questions. Okay, this is where we start moving from understanding into dismantling. Anti-Semitism, for all the reasons I've laid out, is really hard to dismantle because it doesn't make sense. It's confusing on purpose, right? Like it's not meant to be clear and easy to understand. If it was, it would be easy to challenge conspiracy theories, confusion, etc. So when we talk about anti-Semitism, I really tried to get this point home. The who is benefiting, the who is using it, that is the most important thing we need to be thinking about. So one way, a national group I work with called Bend the Arc and an amazing writer called Sharon Goldsvik has developed to help us talk about this is something called the machinery of division and fear. There is a trend in talking about anti-Semitism, maybe you've heard it. It's like a cancer, it's a disease, it's the oldest history, it's inevitable. It's not. Racism isn't inevitable, we can end it. Anti-Semitism isn't inevitable, we can end it. All these things are made by people and we can dismantle them. And so it's really important that we have that framing. So we talk about this machinery of division and fear. Anti-Semitism is part of a machinery of division and fear created and used for specific material and political gain, right? That's the most important line, let's remember that. So this suggests to us that anti-Semitism was built by people and is used by people for a specific purpose, and these people are the ones who benefit most from its use. And this is, you think about if I was talking to someone in 1930s Germany, and, we're talking about like why is everyone hating, like what are the Jews doing, and how can we unpack and dismantle anti-Semitism at that time? Obviously, it's not a real conversation. If we step back and say, who is creating this and who is it benefiting? It's not benefiting the working people of Germany. Their inflation is still going up. Nothing is being done about increasing costs of life. Jews didn't cause World War I, none of these things are actually done by or benefiting the people. But we do know that it benefited the Nazis' rise to power because the conspiracies they spread about the Jews as the banker, as the socialist, the fear they used from it, that benefited the Nazis. So it's an important question. Who is using it? Who is benefiting from it? Anyone can fuel anti-Semitism, intentionally or unintentionally, right? Working class German in 1920s Germany who repeats the myth they have heard in the newspaper, Jews are controlling the banks, is fueling anti-Semitism. They might not be a nasty person, but they are fueling anti-Semitism. We can stop it, we can shut it down, we can dismantle it, and last but not least, anti-Semitism is part of a larger whole, directly connected to other problems, and addressing it is intrinsically connected to other struggles. So it's really important that we take this, like we can dismantle it. It is important to do it. It's not something that will just be there. And that we need to tie it into our attempts to dismantle other oppressions as well. Okay, I'm going to pause for some questions on this idea of anti-Semitism being used. The idea of it, yeah. Any questions? Microphone.
So I recently had the opportunity to go to the Holocaust Museum, and I was quite struck by a number of things parallel to today. One was that Hitler was not exactly an anti-Semitic. He just used what was already existing in the culture so that he could create an autocracy. And I think it's the same model that Trump is using with immigrants, just using what already exists in order to ride to power and oligarchy. Also, Jews were not allowed to be part of the trade unions in Europe, and that's why they worked in business and commerce, because they couldn't work with their hands.
I'll just add on to that from Lainey and thinking about the anti-immigrant rhetoric that's happening now. Also, the anti-trans rhetoric feels very resonant and similar here.
My roommate in college was from Poland, and her family was expelled in 1970 from Poland. And she grew up Jewish and went to school and had friends. And one day, everything changed. Things were put out because of political views a handful of Jews had. It went out, and she said all of her classmates changed. And she was in school with people who suddenly were treating her like the enemy. And she said it just took a few days. And then a few days later, they were expelled. And I think that when we talk about being afraid to speak up or this and that and this and that, it just has to be stopped. You know, you are keeping a killing machine going when you don't speak up. And I think that's the hardest thing for us to realize, how intense the consequences are for not speaking up. And so that has always stayed with me.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I'm gonna ask a different question, and I would love folks to feel like this is a safe and a good space to like say something you might not be sure about, and we're not gonna like come on it. We're just gonna be like, can anyone think of a modern example today where you're like, is this an example of anti-Semitism and Jews being used for a bigger, either to shut down free speech, to just attack democracy? Is there an example? I'm gonna go right at the back.
I want to start by saying thank you for being here. Really appreciate it. I'm really confused by the way the supposed fight against anti-Semitism has been turned on its head right now, where people who have an agenda, who are in power, who want to gain power, are using sort of this mantle of, oh, we're fighting anti-Semitism, to actually do the things that anti-Semitism does. And I'm just baffled, and I don't know how to get my head around it. Do you have insights?
Yeah, I wanted you to bring something like this up. I wanted something like this to come up. Does anyone have a specific example of this that they wanted to bring up?
Harvard.
Can you say a little more?
Because of supposed anti-Semitism at Harvard, although I think the president is Jewish, of Harvard, they're saying, that they'll take all sorts, billions of dollars away from, the academic programs. It's incredible to me, but that seems like a very clear example of anti-Semitism.
Great.
Ironically.
Yeah. I'm going to talk for a bit, so save your questions and comments on this. Anti-Semitism is confusing, right? You actually said it. This is confusing. I don't understand the nuances of it. That's the point, right? That's the point of it. It is meant to make us confused and be unclear who is actually, I don't believe in bad guys, but who is the bad guy and who is actually just like part of the system struggling to dismantle it. So firstly, give yourselves a breath and a break to be confused in this moment. It's okay. There is a lot of confusion around conflation between criticism of Israel, which is a Jewish state, for better and for worse, the complexity of that, what criticism of Israel is too much and is anti-Semitic versus what criticism of Israel is acceptable. Between us as like people who all support Palestinian freedom, equal rights, dignity, there is that real conversation. At what point is the line? That's not what anyone in government is doing. All the things that the government and right-wing institutions are pushing, they don't care about Jews. They're busy plastering George Soros' face everywhere. They don't care about Jews. Trump said he likes his Jews as his bankers and otherwise doesn't care about them. You know, Rudy Giuliani is a great example. He said, George Soros isn't Jewish. It's fine to attack George Soros. I'm more Jewish than George Soros, right? Like, he doesn't care about Jews. But it is very useful for them to use Jews as a wedge to divide us, right? A really interesting example is after October 7th and after the beginning of the genocide in Gaza, a number of alt-right people, Charlie Kirk-esque people, put out pro-Palestine things which ended up being shared by tons and tons and tons of lefties, right? That's confusing. They don't care about Jews. They don't care about Palestine. Then other people on the right put out tons of stuff that was pro-Israel. They don't care about Jews. They don't care about Palestine. They are doing this to divide us, to fuel this machinery of fear and division, to make sure that we are confused and divided. So where does that lead us? It's complicated. But it's really important when someone says, this is an incident of anti-Semitism at Harvard, and we say, okay, what's actually going on? Is there someone who's in danger? Is it just political debate? Is someone uncomfortable? Is someone's free speech being silenced, right? Or is this a right-wing attack on our institutions of freedom, our institutions of democracy? And we can say with, I think, the great example at Harvard is the former president of Harvard, who there was this hearing on campus anti-Semitism, this long hearing in the House, and it was a day long. And there was actually really interesting stuff that got said in that hearing. For example, there was at one campus where there was huge disagreements over Israel and Palestine, and the professors actually of the Middle East department and the Jewish Studies department got together and gave people support in how to have hard political conversations together to de-escalate conflict and encourage freedom of speech. That didn't make the news. That's not interesting, right? The right-wing Republicans didn't care about that. There was other examples of work to try and create safe conversations for students on campus. That didn't make the news because that's not interesting. What did make the news was a bunch of gotcha questions Republicans put forward to presidents of colleges, particularly presidents who were people of color, who supported DEI initiatives. And what we know now is that they used anti-Semitism as a smokescreen to go after their targets, which were what they considered affirmative action hires or DEI, pro-DEI people. So again, what we have here is there is anti-Semitism on campuses. Are the people who are talking about it actually interested in fighting and helping and stopping anti-Semitism, or are they interested in using anti-Semitism as a wedge to get rid of the things that they don't like and go after that agenda? That is real, right? And anti-Semitism is real. And one of the things that happens is we often don't take it very seriously on the left because it's pretty invisibilized. I'd say we have been in the part of the cycle where Jews are successful, right? Many Jews are integrated, well off, not systemically excluded from institutions. And so we're like, it's not real, it doesn't exist. It doesn't look like anti-Black oppression in this country. It doesn't look like oppression against immigrants in this country. So it can't be the same. It's not the same, but it is there. And every time we ignore it because we say, well, that would make us pro-Israel, that would make us on the side of rich people, whatever it is, we lose. And so there's a really important part of when someone says there is something anti-Semitic happening, How do we take it seriously in a way that doesn't further divide us? I said a lot of things. Let's do 2 questions. These 2, yeah.
Oh, I just had a comment that I'm acutely aware of being Black in America and remembering the names of Goodman, Schwerner, and Cheney. I believe one of the guys was Black. That would be Cheney, and 2 were Jewish, if I recall correctly. So I know that Black people and Jewish people have this deep connection. I'm also aware that there's anti-Semitism in the Black community in America. And I'm trying to work towards the day where we can see the relationship between racism and anti-Semitism and homophobia and anti-GLPT and anti-women rhetoric, because I think they're all connected.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. And I've got a slide on this at the end with like kind of more practical tips. But one of the things that when we talk about how we dismantle anti-Semitism and things we can do, one of the biggest things that JUFJ believes, I believe, is about when is it our moment to shout publicly about the oppression we are facing? When is it our moment to talk privately in partnership and in coalition? What relationships between marginalized groups do we need to have to be able to have those conversations? And what work do we need to do internally in our own communities? So for example, there is a lot of racism in the predominantly white Jewish community. Big part of the work JUFJ does is trying to challenge that in our own community, because it is our responsibility to take on the racism in our community. And we need to give other communities the support and the partnership to take on anti-Semitism in their own communities. And that's a really important thing that I think about a lot, is calling out anti-Semitism isn't always the most helpful thing. Reaching out to someone and saying, hey, this makes me uncomfortable. Can we have a conversation about it? What work can you do in your community to challenge the inherent oppression there? And I think, to me, that's one of the ways I am always interested to build that partnership and relationship, is like, we all have work to do in our own communities and support each other to do. Because the place it's not going to get done is in our, racist, patriarchal institutions. Question over there.
Thank you. It's really helpful to me for you to have described the complexity of this situation where it's being used for nefarious ends and there's actual anti-Semitism. Because I think it's not just that it's for, the effect is not just the political forces that are being rallied through anti-Semitism, it's actually fueling anti-Semitism. So I guess part of my question is, if we were doing more to try to address anti-Semitism directly, do we think that would help to undermine the effect of the right?
It's a great question. I mean, on the surface, the answer is obviously yes. I want to take that question and pause, because you said the word fueling, and I want to go to the next slide where we talk about fueling the machine of anti-Semitism. So I feel like you knew what I was going to say. This is a helpful, I also see there are hands on the screen, so I'm going to go to those next, I didn't realize. This is a helpful way to break down, like, when we see different types of anti-Semitism, how to respond to it. And I want to come back to your question as well. So using versus fueling the machine, right? The machine of anti-Semitism is being created by people to divide us, to create fear between us. There's a big difference between those who are using the machine and those who are fueling it. Who's using it? Donald Trump is using it. He is using it by featuring George Soros in his election ads to scare people into voting for him, to create more division and fear. Trump is using it when he says that there's a migrant caravan being funded by shadowy forces coming to our borders, right? Using anti-Semitism. knows what he's doing. I mean, who knows if he knows what he's doing, but he knows what he's doing, and he doesn't care about Jewish safety in that moment. Fueling the machine, oh, it's funny, I never finished the example there. Fueling the machine, anyone can fuel the machine. I can fuel the machine even as a Jewish person. Anyone can. We might say something or do something anti-Semitic, but we don't necessarily benefit from it, right? We might repeat a trope or a story. A public figure might fuel anti-Semitism by repeating an anti-Semitic trope, and then they lose their job, right? Like, they are fueling anti-Semitism, but they aren't necessarily using it to benefit themselves. And it's important to distinguish the difference, because often the people who are targeted through that are most commonly BIPOC folks, people of color, who speak out on something. They might say something anti-Semitic and are attacked for it. And does that mean they should have said something anti-Semitic? No, absolutely not. Should we do education to challenge that? Yes. But is that person benefiting from it? No. An example I will give is for those who follow DC politics from a few years ago, Councilmember Trayon White, who JUFJ helped to get elected, like, right, we big supporter of his originally, complicated now, said that, Jews control the weather. And yeah, he said I think it was the Rothschild specifically, but yes, right? He got a huge amount of backlash for it. It did not benefit his political career to say so. It did not benefit the causes, specifically Ward 8, that he champions. Like, it did not benefit him. I don't think he is the problem, right? He is repeating something that he has heard. It's wrong. We should do education to challenge it, but we shouldn't try and get him out of office because he said that. And there were many people in the Jewish community who said that we should. And I don't agree with that. I don't think it's helpful. But when Trump or another, right-wing white nationalist says that Jews control the weather, or I don't know, Marjorie Taylor Greene says Jews have space lasers, right? Like, she knows what she's doing. She is using it, and it benefits her politically to say those things. And that is different than when someone is just fueling the machine. Okay, great. I want to go back to this question of if we did more to fight anti-Semitism, would it undermine the right's attempt at anti-Semitism? The answer is yes, right? Why is this important? A lot of times when something anti-Semitic does happen, for example, there's been a lot over the past few years, like Nazi swastikas graffitied on some schools in Montgomery County. I feel like, yeah. And I mean, to be fair, a Nazi swastika is an attack on everyone, but Jewish people obviously feel a tie to that attack. And I remember at the time, our Montgomery County team, heard about this and were like, this is bad, obviously. I think the school wrote a statement saying it was bad, but generally it wasn't seen as a big deal. At the same time, there's been anti-immigrant graffiti in some areas, and there's been there's like a vigil and a rally and a protest, and I think a lot of our volunteers in Maryland were like, why is this not seen as important? Now we can argue, and this is what I would argue to our volunteers, is that Jews aren't currently being attacked by the government in the way that immigrants are. So on the one hand, yes, it's totally okay that we're not responding in the same way to anti-Semitic hate as we are to immigrant hate. On the other hand, what we know about anti-Semitism is that it comes in a cycle. It might not appear to be bad, but if we leave it and we don't address it when it comes up, we open it up to getting much, much worse. And so when an issue of anti-Semitic hate does happen, it actually is really important that we do say something, that we do release a statement, that we do stand up for it. And it challenges this idea that Jews aren't part of our struggle for collective liberation. And we need to take it seriously alongside the other oppressions that we fight against. Let's go on to the last slide, and then I will mostly do questions. Oh, I missed a slide. We've kind of talked about this already, but this is the idea of smokescreen anti-Semitism, politicians, political movements using anti-Semitism to increase racialized fear and division. It's hard to identify, but it is really important that we stop and think about is this being done by someone who has the interests of actually liberating ourselves in the Jewish community, or is this someone who doesn't care about the Jewish community and is just doing this to create a smokescreen for their actual political agenda? And I would go back to the hearing on college campuses, right? The Republican congresswoman from New York who asked all these gotcha questions about anti-Semitism, that's smokescreen anti-Semitism. She doesn't care about Jews. She doesn't care about anti-Semitism. She just wants to get a gotcha moment so she can get rid of college presidents. Let's go on to the last slide. Okay. Moving from understanding to dismantling. We've kind of moved a little bit already, but these are some grounded ways I think we can begin to address dismantling. And I do want to say normally this program is 3 hours on understanding and 3 hours on dismantling. So we've really done a very short version today. So I apologize, but here we are. When anti-Semitism or a claim of anti-Semitism emerges, we need to ask these questions. Who is benefiting from it? Who is using the machine versus fueling the machine, right? Because someone might say an anti-Semitic thing in your community. Do they benefit from this? Does our community benefit from this? Are they using the machine? Are they trying to get some sort of use out of sowing fear and division? Do they benefit from it? And if the answer is no, it's bad. We should do some education to say, hang on, that's a stereotype, that's a conspiracy. But it doesn't mean we need to go all out. Whereas when someone is, I think often of right-wing elected officials who say something that seems innocuous, but actually it's really trying to use Jews to sow fear and division, we should call that out. We should call that out as sowing fear and division and using the Jewish community to do so. One other way to move from understanding to dismantling is recognizing the history of Jewish trauma and persecution. We had all these examples. I think anyone who comes from a marginalized group understands that trauma and persecution doesn't go away when it stops happening to you. It continues through generations. And, I grew up in the Jewish community. My grandma escaped from Germany. And when Brexit happened, I was still living in England at the time. She wrote an email to me and my mom and my sister saying, I know what the beginning of fascism looks like. We're qualified to get German passports, ironically, European passports. She said, go get your EU passport, right now. I know what this looks like, right? The trauma doesn't go away when it's not happening on a day-to-day basis. And that's where a lot of Jewish people are sitting when stuff comes up, when anti-Semitism comes up, when criticism of Israel, however valid it may be, comes up. A lot of Jews are not coming from a place of the same place that you, assuming the majority of you are not Jewish, they're not coming from that same place, they're coming from a different place. We come from a place where our trauma informs how we react. That doesn't mean it's always the way we have to go forward, but it has to be informed by it. And I'm sure anyone who works in therapy, trauma-informed therapy, that kind of thing, this is all important pieces of it. Another way to dismantle, including the fight against anti-Semitism as a core part of the fight against racism and collective liberation. It can't be separate. The people who were on the opposition side too, they want it to be separate. They don't want to touch that fight. Because if we don't touch it, it's theirs, right? In the same way that a lot of mainstream Democrats don't want to touch the immigration fight because they don't know what to say. Great, it becomes the right wing gets to set the agenda. If we say unconditionally that the fight against anti-Semitism is a part of the fight against the fight for collective liberation and the fight against racism, that will make a lot of Jews feel pretty good. That's the first part. Will we always get it right? No. Do we always get everything right in the fight against racism? No. But we have to start wanting to include it and naming it and figuring out how to get it right. And that will do a lot to undermine the right's idea that they own the struggle against anti-Semitism. Last but very much not least, ground in personal and communal relationships. This is true for a lot of anti-oppression work, but I find that when the struggle against oppression takes place on the internet or in media or with mass email chains, it doesn't tend to do much to fight back oppression, right? Like, we don't get a lot done. When we have strong one-to-one relationships with people and we can sit and listen to them and they can sit and listen to us and we've been in the trenches together, that's the way we get through this. And an example I always like to give from JUFJ is that right after October 7th, CASA de Maryland, who I'm sure many of you know do incredible work, is a long time JUFJ partner in Maryland. And they put out a statement on what had happened, the ongoing, at the time, I think it wasn't called a genocide, but what was happening in Gaza. And there were some things in there that some members of the Jewish community, including some members of JUFJ, didn't appreciate. And we can have a debate separately of whether it was or wasn't anti-Semitic, but it was a painful moment and people were feeling very tender. And many members of the Jewish community in Maryland were like, this is outrageous, this is not okay, how dare CASA say this? And JUFJ was like, we know CASA. Like, we work with them all the time. And we said to our volunteers who came to us and said, we're outraged by this, we said, you spend lobby day with them every year. You can call these people, you know these people. You might disagree on what they've said about Israel, but you know they're not anti-Semitic. You have a relationship with them. And a lot of our volunteers were like, okay, I'm calming down. I can see that, like, I might have some feelings about this, but I have a relationship with these people. And that meant that there could have been a huge outcry that CASA, I mean, it still did lose, unfortunately, some very big funding, but like people who could have otherwise kind of burned a bridge instead were like, okay, I have a relationship with these people. I know they care about me. We can work together. And so that's the really important thing, I would say.